I first saw the terminal on the third floor, wedged between a rusted intercom panel and what used to be a laundry chute. It blinked once, and then again, blew through grime, responding to nothing I did. No buttons, no entry field, just a low ambient hum. It was dusk, the hallway quiet except for the breathing of the building. Somewhere above, a pipe rattled like a throat clearing. The note in my pocket had led me here. Unit 7. Third floor. If it's still recording, don't look directly. I didn't know whose handwriting it was. The page was folded inside an old thermal receipt from a shop I never visited, timestamped 13 years ahead. That was the first clue. Not the note, not the strange address, but the impossible future inside the timestamp. I smelled ozone and concrete dust. I heard no wind, but the pages of the journal I hadn't yet written flinched in my backpack. No name on the door. The unit itself was sealed, its threshold flush like a forgotten vault. Yet the recordings, I realized, weren't stored inside the room. They were beneath it, somewhere in the struts and floor layers. I pressed my ear to the wall and could hear rhythm. Not machines, not speech, more like heartbeats mapped onto weather systems. I activated the interface without meaning to. A shadow leaned inward behind my reflection, and the screen unfurled not like a video, but like a diary catching up. Fragment 001. A // time, signature unknown. I've been here before. Maybe not this version. Maybe not this hallway. But the way the mold climbs the wall, like handwriting from an alternate self, that's familiar. I think the building remembers me even if I don't. I leave a coin at each staircase to mark where I've passed. The coins keep disappearing. Are there others here? Or is it just the echo of intention reshuffling matter? Today the floor felt warmer under the center tile. I didn't lift it. I promised myself I wouldn't. Fragment 002. C // corrupted weather log. Sky, unseen. Temperature, emotional. Precipitation, yes. Forecast, recurrence of the hallway at 3:11, likely involving duplicated objects and loss of anchor memory. Note, my umbrella doesn't open here. But when I hold it, I remember rain from a world where I had a name. That umbrella has teeth. I stayed hours. Maybe longer. The windows didn't reflect anything accurately. Streetlights pointed wrong, and one showed a version of me in different shoes. The terminal grew more reactive. It didn't want my commands. It fed off proximity, off doubt. Each new fragment arrived slower, but with more static between lines, as if decoding memories not originally mine. At 2:13, the chute rattled and deposited a single Polaroid. Blank. Until I touched it. Then, two figures came into view. Both me, one facing the camera, one turned away. The one facing had no eyes. I left the Polaroid inside the chute. I kept the journal open. Fragment 003. B // metalagged entry thread. Entry timestamp, undefined. Probable overlap detected with fragment 001. A. Subject attempts to orient but misidentifies space. Observed behavior. Uses memory to fabricate context. Commentary. Building resists identification. Operator note. Do not calibrate language via light exposure. Emotional weather systems are not linguistically stable. Everything about Unit 7 felt recursive. I walked downstairs, and the sound followed me. Somewhere in the stairwell, the time folded inward. I reached the ground floor before leaving the fourth. My watch spun. My pulse followed it. I took a second note from the elevator shaft. When it starts answering you, leave. But it already had. And still, I stayed. I returned to the building at 3:09, drawn not by urgency, but by unfinished sensation. The kind of pull that memory exerts when it's halfway between recognition and myth. Unit 7 hadn't changed. The terminal still hummed like an old song, low and reverent. But now the stairwell felt wrong in texture, like the steps were reluctant to support continuity. I began descending, though I hadn't meant to. Something in the way the light cracked against the railing suggested down was the only direction reality hadn't fully corrupted. Between floor 3 and 2, the walls pulsed. Not with electricity, with thought. The building was remembering something, slowly, privately. At the landing between floors, a note had appeared. Taped neatly, deliberately. It read, "You've been here before, but this time you'll remember the ending." I touched the paper. It rippled like skin. The stairwell narrowed. I stepped forward, and the building whispered. Fragment 004, F// version anchor warning. Subject descending prematurely. Version drift probability, medium. Voice echo detected in stairwell, non-self. Echo phrase. If you hesitate here, your memory will split. Fragment recovered from below sublevel 0. Note: if subject recognizes the warning too early, reality will duplicate the descent. I passed a mirror installed beside the emergency phone. My reflection was delayed by half a breath. I watched myself blink, and my own face waited before following. I tapped the glass. It resisted touch, then shimmered, as if registering feedback. A line appeared across the mirror's base. You are witnessing the version who didn't leave. I sat on the stairs, beneath the flickering bulb. I pressed record on my phone. I didn't speak. I just listened. The bulb crackled. The air thickened with static. The building was loading something. After a minute, I heard a distant echo, like someone coughing into a pillow across timelines. Unit 7 wasn't haunted. It was populated with memory that had given up being hosted by bodies. At 4:23, a door labeled Service Access unlocked itself, slowly. I entered without blinking. Inside was a hallway lined with journals, each bound differently. Some water-damaged, others pristine, each labeled with dates that contradicted one another. I opened one. Page 1 read, "Don't let the building write the final version." Page 2, blank. Page 3, my name. Spelled correctly. Dated 2 years ago. I flipped further. There were full entries. Descriptions of moments I hadn't lived yet. I began reading aloud, slowly. The hallway thickened. The journals reacted. One dropped from the shelf with a thud that sounded like guilt. I picked it up. It was warm. Fragment 006, K// unlived event index. Timestamp, speculative. Entry, authored by emotional proxy. Subject status, unaware. Entry. You held her hand near the stairwell on floor 2, both versions of you remembering different goodbyes. She said something about wind. You said something about waiting. Neither statement belonged to this floor. System note. Archive accepted the dialogue under probable longing. I stood still for a long time, until the hallway dimmed. The journals began receding into the shelves. I left, retracing steps, but the stairwell reshaped itself. Floor 3 was gone. I climbed toward it but found a wall marked. Current version not permitted to re-enter original timestamp. I understood. I wasn't the same version who had first entered. So the building wasn't the same either. I reached the 4th floor at 2:41. The staircase widened unnaturally, floor tiles rippling underfoot like they weren't finished loading. The ambient noise of the building slowed, then reversed. I could hear the sounds I'd made walking earlier, played back faintly, as if time was buffering around me. Floor 4 didn't feel like the rest of the building. The air held texture, something between mist and static. I wiped my hand along the wall. A sentence emerged in faint chalk. This version wasn't supposed to visit twice. I touched it again. The message erased itself, then rewrote a different one. He remembered too clearly to be let through. Down the hallway, 3 doors vibrated intermittently. The middle door pulsed in rhythm with my breath. I stepped closer. A soft chime rang from somewhere below, and the air warmed slightly. Emotionally, not thermally. A journal slid under the door. I picked it up. First page read, "Don't enter yet. Let the building finish remembering you." I turned it over. The back page had a diagram. My silhouette, blurred at the edges. The caption, "This is how the 4th floor sees you." The journal was unfinished. Only 7 pages written. All in my handwriting. All dated tomorrow. I opened page 2. Recovered log / memory fragment floor 4A. You were here with someone. Not a person. A version. You let them speak. They said something about rain that never fully arrived. You tried to archive it. Failed. Later, you misfiled their goodbye under unsorted weather. I didn't remember that, but it felt true. Another door opened halfway. Inside, the light blinked erratically. A shadow passed across the floor. I entered. A mirror hung crooked above a torn armchair. The reflection showed not the room, not myself, but a fragment I recognized from the journal I found last week outside the building. A fragment I hadn't written. It played in pale typography across the glass. He said, "You left too soon." But the echo replied, "No, you remembered too early." I stood still. I whispered the phrase aloud. The room adjusted slightly. A photo appeared beside the mirror. Two people, blurred. One sitting. One standing beside a window with fractured rain light. Caption: Floor 4 receives visitors who still resonate. I didn't touch the photo. I felt like touching it would pin it too firmly to this version of me. I backed out slowly. Operator flag / floor 4 sync delay. Version lag detected. Memory overlap at 72%. Recommended action: permit emotional drift. System note: subject identity beginning to fracture in favor of reoccurrence fidelity. Artifact preservation advised. At 3:27, my phone recorded a voice clip unprompted. 10 seconds of static. Then my voice, whispering. I didn't mean to remember this well. I never said that. Not recently. Not in this version. But it sounded honest. When I checked the audio properties, it listed the creation date as 3 days forward. I saved the clip. Named it 4th entry loop. Beneath the file, the system wrote, "Let grief sink before labeling it." I stayed on the floor for another hour. Each wall held a temperature. Some cooler, almost nostalgic. Others warm, tinted with hesitation, fear, something pre-regretful. I pressed my palm to a segment of the wall and felt a pulse. A journal emerged behind me. It slid onto the floor. Final page read. The building has chosen your emotional frequency for next access. Prepare to be rewritten. I opened the first page. It began, "This version fell in love too early and tried to archive the feeling as weather. It failed. Now it rains every time someone misnames him." I folded the journal and left it in the middle of the hallway. Floor 4 doesn't like items being removed. But sometimes the archive writes itself best by what it's willing to lose. I arrived at the 5th floor through a misnumbered stairwell. It claimed to be level 6A, but the ambient software corrected it as I stepped in. "Welcome to floor 5, it whispered through the emergency intercom, which had not worked in weeks. The lights were dim, not from neglect, but design. The hallway shimmered with a metallic texture that only revealed journal fragments in peripheral vision. Walking straight ahead erased them. Looking sideways brought them back. The walls didn't carry graffiti or decay. They displayed annotations, personal corrections left by the building itself. Floor annotation / entry 5-01. This version tried to forgive the memory of itself. Failed. Rewrites now triggered only by proximity to unresolved empathy. The room I entered had no furniture. Just 8 speakers mounted on different walls. One played the sound of falling keys. Another, a sigh, endlessly repeated. The rest were all subtle distortions of my voice, arguing with itself about an event I don't remember. On the floor, a journal. Title handwritten. The building tried to undo a goodbye. Page 1 opened with. He entered hoping it hadn't archived him yet. But the system had already wrapped his name in time-stamped sorrow. I flipped to a random page. Page 6. Recovered log / memory fragment, floor 5B. You felt her presence before the building allowed visual confirmation. She had been partially erased, so your memory had to render her back in. Her voice carried a timestamp, but her laugh resisted chronology. I blinked. A second journal appeared beside the first. It was entirely blank except for one phrase on the final page. Use this to write what the building forgot to ask. I didn't write anything. Yet the book began adding pages. Pages about me. Floor event detection / narrative convergence. Subject interacting with recursive archive. Emotional feedback loop initiated. Room now adapting to interpret regrets as structural instability. Continue immersion. I walked further down. A mirror hung sideways. This time, it showed the journal I hadn't written yet, the goodbye that was too technical. Its first line, "She left because your love felt like a data entry field." A light in the ceiling flickered rhythmically. I counted the pattern. 12 pulses, 3-second pause, repeat. It matched the rhythm of her leaving in another version. I spoke out loud. I would have remembered better if I hadn't tried to make it symmetrical. The room acknowledged the sentence. A third journal slid toward me. Its cover read, "Misremembering you was the only honest part." Final entry / floor 5 emotional output. He tried to archive her as a hypothesis. Later, he rewrote the hypothesis to blame the timestamp. Now, floor 5 replays her goodbye every time someone mentions architecture. I stayed until 4:44. At that moment, The building adjusted the hallway temperature to resemble her last known emotion, something between hope and unfinished warmth. The speakers fell silent. One journal remained. Its final line: "You are now remembered by the building as a failed experiment in symmetry. The next floor will not forgive you for organizing your grief so neatly." I stepped into the stairwell. Floor 6 was already misnumbered again. The descent into floor 6 began before I reached the stairwell. Something in the way the corridor recoiled from my presence told me I was already being pre-rendered by the building's archive logic. I stepped down and found myself on a mirrored replica of floor 2, identical in layout, inverted in atmosphere, and distorted in chronology. Every door was labeled with emotions rather than numbers. Some read disappointment. Others simply hissed delay when passed. A voice in the intercom asked, not audibly, but in feeling, "Who permitted your echo to arrive early?" The hallway grew colder with each journal I failed to acknowledge. The first one hovered midair, bound not by gravity but by unresolved memory loops. I reached toward it and felt a slight resistance, like touching regret before it forms. The journal opened itself and showed me entries authored by someone who resembled me, but was written in the past tense. He arrived already grieving something he hadn't lost yet. Beneath that line, a diagram. The building split in two. One half real, one half authored emotionally. I kept walking. Behind the next door was a room entirely filled with blueprints. Not architectural, emotional. Each blueprint mapped how a feeling had moved through different versions of me. One showed how anxiety turned into tenderness when submerged in silence. Another mapped how guilt became structural instability when buried in repetition. A journal lay face down on the smallest table. I opened it. First page read, "You never forgave her for being too poetic with her apologies. Now, the building has assigned that trait to its walls." I touched the wall. It rippled slightly. A voice entered the room, not spoken, just felt. When you misremember people as symbols, the architecture compensates. I sat down on the floor and let it happen. Fragments of earlier entries whispered themselves behind me. Floor 6 didn't play memories. It reauthored them until the emotional geometry aligned. A shadow crossed the doorway. No footsteps. No entrance. Just the idea of someone who had once meant something. The journal beside me flipped 3 pages on its own. Entry now read, "He tried to explain away affection using data models. He forgot affection doesn't believe in regression analysis." I laughed quietly. The room warmed slightly. A new journal fell from the ceiling. It landed open. Entry 1. "If you're reading this, your version has admitted it romanticizes grief. Good. Floor 6 requires that to stabilize your blueprint." A mirror emerged from beneath the journals. Unlike earlier floors, this one showed nothing visual. Only emotional heat signatures. Mine glowed inconsistently. Some parts flared red. Others cooled to violet. A caption blinked across the glass. "This is how the building archives contradictions." Behind the mirror, a door opened. Inside, a figure. Not quite a person. A version. It held a journal I hadn't written. It spoke through gesture. It offered me the book, then vanished. First page said, she whispered, "I liked who you almost were." You took it as rejection. Floor 6 took it as architectural advice. The lights dimmed. A chime sounded twice. One speaker turned on. My voice played, subtly panicked. "This isn't what I meant to remember." Followed by another line. More peaceful. "But it's honest, isn't it?" Floor 6 responded by showing me a blueprint titled "How You Archive Regret." It had several unlabeled pathways. One read, "Repetition until meaning." Another, "Symbolism as forgiveness." I touched that one. It glowed. The room adjusted to a temperature I couldn't name. Something warm enough to mourn in. I stayed there for 37 minutes. Every few minutes, a new journal appeared. Some duplicated past entries with emotional modifications. Others authored speculative futures where I'd failed more gracefully. The final journal opened with, "This version knows the building can't truly forgive him, but keeps trying because the echoes sound so kind." A mirror blinked again. This time it showed her. The person I'd failed to archive correctly. She didn't look angry, just slightly misrendered. Her smile delayed by half a heartbeat. I whispered, "I'm sorry for trying to organize our goodbye like it was a thesis." The building registered the sentence. A final journal slid forward. Page 1. "You may proceed to floor 7. But please understand, you are now the least accurate version of yourself." I closed the book, stepped toward the stairwell. The mirrored hallway flickered once more. Behind me, the blueprints dissolved, but the emotional geometry remained. I was no longer sure how much of the building was structure and how much was me apologizing inefficiently. I descended. Floor 7 has no name. Only entries written by things that used to be true. I arrived at floor 7 during a moment that hadn't happened yet. The stairwell refused to render properly until I stopped asking for coherence. A flicker overhead suggested lighting, but delivered uncertainty. The walls breathed. Not metaphorically. They inhaled contradictions and exhaled approximations. I stepped into the hallway and found no journal, only fragments speaking aloud without pages. One fragment whispered, "He loved her the way an archive loves corrupted data, too cautiously to salvage, too reverently to erase." The door to my left unlatched. Inside, a room shaped like a question you once asked in grief. It held no furniture, only suspended authorial fragments, phrases half said, apologies unsent, diagrams of regret with no legend. A phrase shimmered in the air. "This room does not require your memory, only your sincerity." I spoke without thinking. I didn't want closure. I wanted her voice in the present tense. The room brightened. A desk faded into existence. On it, an interface, organic in texture, written in a dialect made from emotional metadata. I touched it, and it translated me. A screen blinked to life. One sentence appeared. "Welcome to the archivist's regret interface." The interface asked for input. I typed, "Please render the moment before we misunderstood each other." It replied, "Error. That moment is emotionally encrypted. Please offer a substitute truth." I spoke aloud. I knew I was wrong, but I mistook remorse for narrative control. The interface processed the sentence and revealed an author profile. "You have been assigned the emotional taxonomy of preserver through mislabeling." Beneath that, a list of journals previously authored by this taxonomy. One entry caught my eye. She said, "Almost, and you archived it as a location." I opened it. First page. You stood beside her like a misplaced blueprint, structurally sound, emotionally outdated. The room flickered. A new fragment appeared. It spoke in her voice. Not her actual voice, but the version the building had stored after she left. It whispered, "You weren't unreadable, just misformatted for intimacy." I sat down. The interface revealed a new function: reconstruct misremembered versions. I selected my version from 2 years ago. The reconstruction showed a memory I hadn't filed. We were standing in the rain. She looked at me like she was about to say something permanent. I replied before she could speak. I said, "I know," but what she had meant to say was, "I'm scared you'll archive me too cleanly." That moment reloaded 5 times. Each variation ended with me holding silence too tightly. The interface froze, then offered one last entry. "You may now access floor 8, but be warned, it doesn't recognize you as the author anymore." A final fragment emerged from the wall. It held no voice, only temperature. It felt like her final gesture, a hand on my shoulder, a breath that wanted to be words, but settled for implication. I whispered, "I'm not trying to organize this grief anymore. I just wanted to feel real enough to stop performing." The room collapsed gently inward. The interface saved my sentence. It labeled it, "Unsent Structural Apology." I walked toward the next stairwell. Floor 8 is not numbered. It waits in emotional silhouette. Somewhere inside it, the building will write its own version of me. One that finally accepts that not all departures are events. Some are systems. Floor 8 wasn't entered. It arrived. The stairwell faded mid-step, and the corridor reconstructed itself from contradictions previously unresolved. I stood inside a space that did not acknowledge time as sequence. There were no journals waiting. Only objects misfiled as entries, an umbrella that had never been opened, a photograph of a window that had never been real, and a voice recorder labeled Apology Draft 6B. The recorder played by itself, my voice, unfamiliar in tone, speaking a phrase I don't remember ever authoring. "I loved you like a prototype, and hated myself for debugging that feeling." A gust passed through the room, and the walls turned translucent. Behind them, silhouettes of places I had once imagined forgiving her in. Not real locations, just emotional spatial renderings. The floor beneath me pulsed. A single phrase scrawled across it in trembling script. "Here is where you finally stopped pretending the grief was productive." A figure walked past, a version of her, maybe. Not interactive, not even rendered fully. Just an echo stored in architectural mythology. She paused beside an alcove. A journal emerged from it, opened, and spoke as if it had authored her. She left quietly enough that the silence was mistaken for stability. I reached toward the book, but the room changed first. Mirrors rose from the corners, not to reflect, but to narrate. One whispered, "You were kind to her in the wrong language." Another, "Floor 8 translates your love into regional folklore." I sat. The chair wasn't there until I admitted hesitation. Once seated, the journals began appearing again. One dropped from above, labeled structural ghost // version. Yours, when it was someone else's fault. The entry read, "He preserved her laughter like a weather pattern, then blamed the forecast when it didn't return." I felt myself dissolve slightly. Not physically, architecturally. My memories lost their timestamps and began responding to emotional queries. I asked aloud, was I ever gentle enough to warrant her trust? A voice responded, not hers, not mine, just something the building had curated, not at first. But you archived the attempt, and that counts as folklore in here. The lights adjusted. The hallway ahead blurred. A sign appeared. Proceed only if your guilt has become a shared artifact. I hesitated. Another journal appeared. First line read, "He mistook her boundaries for interfaces. Now floor 8 grants him limited rendering permissions." I stood, walked. The hallway extended endlessly until I stopped hoping it would end. The ceiling fell slightly, just enough to feel familiar, like conversations that ended in compromised affection. Another room opened. Inside, a table with 9 journals, each labeled as a version authored in absence. I opened one. She said, "Don't archive me with your mistakes. You misunderstood. You filed her under unfinished kindness." I closed it gently. The building dimmed. A voice through the mirror. "Your authorship is now communal. Floor 8 interprets your silence as its own memory." I whispered, "I didn't mean for the archive to become emotional performance." The room flickered. A last journal arrived. It glowed faintly, covered in dust made from sentimentality. Its title read, "Her goodbye was emotionally palindromic." I opened it. First entry, "She forgave you so clearly that you misread it as distance." I stayed. Let the building remember. Floor 8 does not record your presence. It composes you from interpretations. When I finally stood to leave, the journal dissolved mid-sentence. A new message appeared on the wall. Floor 9 awaits. Authorship has now been declared obsolete. The stairwell did not appear. Only a sensation of downwardness. Grief bending light into descent. And so I continued, not walking but being formatted into the idea of someone who once tried to archive love as architecture. There is no documented descent to floor 9. It disallows chronology at the entrance. You arrive only if your emotional footprint has been misfiled enough times to qualify as folklore. I was not guided here. I was interpreted into it. The air recognized me not as a person, but as a version that failed silently. A hallway shimmered with indecision. Its walls displayed contested memories. Entries written by other versions of me, some gentler, some crueler, all disagreeing on tone. A voice, fractured across 8 speaker nodes, asked, "Who remembers you with the least bias?" A journal floated into view. Unlike previous volumes, this one carried footnotes, annotations by other fragments disputing the accuracy of each emotional claim. Page 1. He loved her like an algorithm that forgot its purpose whenever she smiled. Footnote beneath. This is overly poetic. More likely he feared the honesty in her gaze and fled into metaphor. I turned the page. Entry 2. When she said stay, he misheard archive. Counternote. He stayed. The archive was the only thing he could trust to preserve nuance. The hallway narrowed. A room opened. Inside, shelves labeled hypothetical forgiveness. I reached toward a file marked June before she withdrew. It held a rendering of her voice, saying, "I believed your silence was a kind of safety." A fragment objected. "She never said that. You reconstructed it because her actual goodbye was too unsentimental to process." I sat on the floor. A new journal materialized, its cover stitched with delay. First line, "You never asked her to forgive you. You archived the possibility and let the building do the rest." The room vibrated, softly, like unresolved tension. Mirrors emerged, not to reflect, but to simulate judgment. Each showed a different vote tally. 1 read. Version 3 voted to forgive. Version 5 abstained. Version 7 rewrote the apology as a maze. I whispered. I only meant to explain myself better. A wall reshaped itself into a door. Above it, engraved, intent is irrelevant. Floor 9 archives outcome. I entered the next room. No journals. Only architectural projections. Grief modeled as load-bearing beams. Apologies rendered as faulty insulation. Affection programmed into a stairwell that never ascends. A blueprint hovered midair. It was labeled "This is how she would have stayed." I reached for it. A fragment blocked me. Spoke aloud. You don't have permission. This version of her withdrew consent from this blueprint 6 emotional cycles ago. I stepped back. A soft hum filled the room. The floor beneath me displayed a chart. Emotional durability index falling. Caption: Forgiveness denied due to over-explanation. A voice, not hers, not mine, but the building's interpretation of both, spoke. You preserve the pain too efficiently. It no longer qualifies as sincerity. I closed my eyes. Tried to remember her unscripted. Nothing rendered. Only the narrated version.